Canada, our home, is much more than just our home. It is a place of refuge, of hope, and a place where one can create a better life for themselves and their families. Our families chose to immigrate to Scarborough because they believed that they could provide more for their children here than in Italy or Greece. After all, this is the land of opportunities.
Our grandparents came to Canada in search of a new beginning, and this wasn't an easy thing to do. Immigration during the 1950s and 60s, in comparison to present day immigration, proved to be a more difficult journey, especially since there were so many barriers that weren't so easily broken down as they can be today. I remember eating lunch at my Nanu and Nana's house when I was young, and hearing them tell stories about coming to Canada and leaving everything behind in Italy. Aside from my Nana's delicious cooking, those stories were the highlight of my meal. I remember hanging off of every word my Nanu said in his broken English as he rehashed the struggles he faced immigrating to Scarborough and the pride he had in becoming a Canadian. Remembering their stories now, I have grown to appreciate the struggles they have faced in order to have a better future for their children and their grandchildren.
Ever since I was little, I can remember listening to my grandmother tell her stories about her life in Greece and her life here in Canada. But it wasn't until recently that I've come to truly understand her, and I now can see how she has survived. There is always so much to learn as long as you are willing to sit down and listen to their stories.
William Mackenzie was a Canadian political leader from the 1920s to the late 1940s. During World War II, he was on the side of the United States, France, and Great Britain. When Mussolini announced that Italy's support on behalf of Germany and Japan, Mackenzie enacted the War Measures Act and turned on Italian Canadians, giving the RCMP power to intern 300 Italian Canadians. Mackenzie branded Italian Canadians as enemy aliens and suggested that they posed an internal threat to Canada. In his radio broadcast on June 10, 1940, he said that
a state of war existed with the German Reich. The Minister of Justice has authorized the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to take steps to intern all residents of Italian origin whose activities have given ground for the belief or reasonable suspicion that they might, in time of war, endanger the safety of the state or engage in activities prejudicial to the prosecution of the war.
Italian Canadians faced discrimination and prejudice based on Mussolini's position in World War II. They experienced restrictions to their freedoms and had their rights taken away from them. Mackenzie gave the RCMP power to intern any Italian that was deemed suspicious. Internment camps were established in Petawawa, Ontario, and Alberta in an effort to control Italian activity. Italian men were imprisoned in these camps and faced abuse and mistreatment by officials. What is more shocking was that no Italian was ever charged or even guilty of conspiracy against Canada.
the conflict between Canada and Italy during World War II limited Italian immigration to Canada. The treatment immigrants faced from society and the government detracted from Canada's allure, and Canadians were less open and tolerant towards new immigrants. The War Measures Act, put in place in 1940, caused many obstacles for Italians and tainted the image of Italian culture. It wasn't until 1947, when the restrictions were lifted and Canada became more migration friendly, that immigration to Canada drastically increased from all over Europe.
The growing poverty, oppressive taxation, crop failures, and political persecution in Greece forced many Greeks to leave their country in search of better social and economic opportunities. Many, like my grandparents, were attracted to Canada because the government was more geared to importing cheap labor to develop the economy. Their idea was that they would come to Canada, make their money, then eventually go back to Greece. This was and still is the mentality of many Greeks. There was a large influx of Greek immigrants to Canada the post-war, who were classified as unskilled workers, and they were placed in the factories, they worked in the restaurants, or they cleaned houses or commercial buildings. The disruption of the Greek economy by the Italian and Nazi occupation around 1941 to 1944 saw to high unemployment rates, and therefore many Greeks had to seek employment elsewhere. This chart provides a visual of the fluctuation of the number of immigrants who came to Canada during the 1950s to the 1960s. Our grandparents were one of them.
The main reason for European immigration to Scarborough was to have economic success. Canada, to many immigrants, is a land of opportunities. Canada protects the rights and freedom for all and is known to be the country of peace and equality. European immigrants chose to migrate to Canada to escape the economic failures or social injustices within their home countries. My Nana realized that her hometown did not hold many economic possibilities for her to start a family. She believed coming to Scarborough and working hard would give her and her children a better future.
My grandparents had decided to come to Canada because they believed that they could provide more for their family here than they would have in Greece. My grandfather, who was an artist in Greece, teaching students at a local university, thought he would be able to succeed as an artist here in Canada, since he was not classified as a regular laborer. Once he came to Canada, he realized that the people here were not interested in having fancy paintings in their homes, but instead they wanted their homes to be the works of art, and he ended up becoming a house painter.
Presently, Scarborough is known as the city of diversity and multiculturalism. Traces of accepting new cultures in Scarborough were evident in 1950 and 1960s because Europeans were able to gather in their own neighborhoods to celebrate their own cultures. The high population of immigrants coming to Scarborough between the 1950s and 60s contributed to the multiculturalism present today. Although immigrants tried to hold on to their culture, it was imperative that they adapt to Canadian society in order to be successful. Chain migration was an apparent trend during the 1950s and 60s. Newcomers that were establishing themselves in Canada sponsored family members from home to migrate to Canada. The connection between families sponsoring each other and migrating to Canada increased the population of immigrants, which strengthened Scarborough's expansion and multiculturalism. Chain migration was important when my Nana was applying to Canada because she was sponsored by friends that she had from Italy. Her friends had migrated to Scarborough in the early 1940s and sponsored my Nana to come to Canada. My Nana was sponsored by my Nana, and he came here in 1963. My grandparents met in Italy through one of my Nana's brothers. They sent letters back and forth when my Nana was in Canada, talking about my grandfather's sponsorship to Canada. When my Nana was finally accepted, he settled here and found work. Then he tried to sponsor his youngest brother to come to Canada. My Nana also sponsored her brother to come to Canada. Chain migration was apparent in my family because both of my grandparents brought family over for better lives.
The large influx of Greek immigration to Canada was due to chain migration. The relatives that were already established in Canada sponsored many immigrants after the 1950s. Now, my grandparents didn't have any relatives here in Scarborough, but they did have some in the United States, and it wasn't until the late 1970s, early 1980s that they left Canada for some time and went to the US to live with their family.
For new immigrants to come to Scarborough, there were specific rules that they had to agree to in order to be accepted into Canada. For example, when new immigrants were sponsored to come to Canada, they had to prove that they had work waiting for them and would not be a burden to the Canadian government. Those that sponsored new immigrants were responsible for them for 5 years. They had to confirm that newcomers were working and contributing to the Canadian economy. New immigrants had to be in perfect health and were examined by doctors to show that they were in top physical condition to join the Canadian labor force. My Nanu told me that his application to Canada was rejected a few times because he could not get a clean bill of health from the doctors. Although he was perfectly healthy, he simply did not have enough money to pay the doctors off. I remember him telling me about the corruption hopeful immigrants experience and how people would take advantage of newcomers to make money off of them since they were so vulnerable. Immigration to Scarborough was a challenging process because many Europeans did not have the economic means to support their journey. Many had to sell their belongings or take out loans to pay the fare. Travel by air was extremely expensive and usually unattainable for the majority of hopeful immigrants. In 1958, my Nana traveled by ship for 10 days to get to Canada. She will never forget how seasick all the passengers were, and to this day, she will never board another ship. My Nana's family did not have a lot of money, so for her to get her ticket to board her ship, her parents sold their home and divided it between my Nana and her sister. Her sister paid for her wedding, and my Nana used her share for a ship ticket to Halifax and a train ride to Scarborough. This is an actual picture of my Nana's ship called the Queen Frederica.
During the 1960s, my grandparents had struggled with finding stable employment in Greece, so my grandfather had traveled to where the work was. They went to Belgium first. Here, my grandmother's family resided, and my grandfather worked in the mines. But soon, this was no longer desirable, so they set their sights on Canada. My papu had come to Canada a few months prior to my yaya in 1969, because he had wanted to settle down first and be able to support his family. While taking a boat was an option, it was a long journey, especially for a single mother with two young children with her. When it was time for my yaya to come to meet her husband, she bought a plane ticket. This ticket took her 2 years to pay off. $20 a month for 2 years is a lot of money to be owing, especially since back then, $20 could fill their fridge of groceries.
Traveling to Scarborough was a popular choice for European immigrants because this area was more willing to adopt European culture. Scarborough was a safe place to raise a family while also offering work, affordable housing, and it was accessible by public transit. The Scarborough community embodied the Canadian dream, as my Nana told me. When she came to Scarborough and saw the green grass, it symbolized the success that awaited her in her new life in Scarborough.
While I was interviewing my grandmother, I had asked her what her first memory was of Canada when she had first arrived. She had recounted a story about how difficult it was not to know the language, and how foreign Scarborough seemed. But she had also remarked upon how beautiful our country was, how clean the streets were, and how friendly the people were when she was more comfortable with her surroundings. It is simple things like these that have come to symbolize Scarborough and its multiculturalism. During the 1950s and 60s, Canada was expanding and needed workers to extract natural resources, work in the factories, and work in construction. Canada encouraged immigration because unskilled or semi skilled immigrants were cheap labor. Europeans were seen as hardworking and more than willing to work for whatever pay they were offered.
For many immigrants, the low wages Canada offered were more than the wages in their own countries. The relationship between Canada and new immigrants benefited both parties, which explains the drastic increase in immigration during this time period. Both my Nana and Nanu were part of the labor movement that supported Canada's expansion. Scarborough was an area that provided factory work for new immigrants and building developments for construction workers as a result of the influx in immigration to Scarborough. Homes, schools, and stores were in demand, therefore creating jobs for newcomers. Generally, immigrants like my Nanu and Nana worked for a lot less than Canadian born laborers. This made new immigrants more attractive workers to the government and large corporations. My Nana worked at Toronto Plastic Company in Scarborough on Midland and Lawrence until 1985. She worked alongside many other European women that were unskilled laborers trying to make enough money to support their families. She stressed on how hot the factories were and how the English barrier limited her abilities to make more money for her family. She witnessed many injustices in the factory but could not say anything because she didn't know the language and there was no job security. My Nanu worked in construction and he built apartment buildings throughout Scarborough till he retired in 1989. He worked hard putting up drywall and he was slowly promoted to foreman, which earned him a little more money. My Nanu had experience working in the Italian military, but he could not get a similar position working in Canada. My Nanu was always proud of the work that he did because he believed in living honestly and working hard to support his family. I feel like the construction my Nanu did in Scarborough symbolizes the hard work European immigrants contributed to the community and the development of Canada.
Upon arrival to Canada, my grandparents didn't speak English, only French and Greek. So even though my grandfather had the intentions of teaching art, as he did in Greece, he had to go to school to learn English first. And even then, the people were not interested in having the works of art in their homes. They wanted to be more economical, more sensible. So there was a market for painting homes or businesses. This is where my grandfather made his living, and he still does today at the age of 74. He went into the union as a painter, and as soon as my father was of age, he went with him. My grandmother did not speak any English, so she could not go out to find a job. This meant she was a stay-at-home mother because they did not know anyone who they could trust to watch their children, nor could they afford it. Therefore, my grandmother taught herself how to speak English by comparing French with the English and watching television. She also learned from experience, and her children taught her how to speak it from when they grew up and went to school. My grandfather was a very talented artist when he was in Greece. Some of his paintings are hanging around my house. And he even taught me how to enhance my own skill. But since visual art was not what my grandfather pursued as his occupation, he learned how to become a high-quality house painter, starting his own business, which my father now runs. These difficulties were only some of what my grandparents and other immigrants faced when coming into Canada. They had to start from scratch, and from where I stand today and how each of their children have grown is a symbol of how hard each of them have worked.
Mucho más,